Hey everybody, this is Mr. Harvey. As promised, here's our Chapter 8 lecture. Please take notes, for my students, please take notes on this lecture while this presentation is going on. And really quickly, just for some copyright information, I do not own this PowerPoint. This is Pearson's PowerPoint. I kind of just added on to enrich this PowerPoint for the context of this class. So here we go. Alright, let's rock and roll. Okay, so this is Chapter 8. We've already talked about the Enlightenment. We're moving on a little bit to what was going on economically and a little bit more politically during this time. And we're going to talk about mercantilism. We're going to talk about the huge trading empires that we see during this time and how, especially in Spain, how it changes after the War of Spanish Succession, the Treaty of Utrecht of 1713. And then we're going to talk about some of the wars during the 18th century, mainly the American Revolution. Here we go. So in this class, it's really important, in AP European History, it's really important to acknowledge one of the key themes of this class, that is Europe interacting with the rest of the world. And we can divide Europe interacting with the rest of the world into 4 periods. We've already talked about the first one. Discovery, the discovery, in quotation marks, exploration, the age of exploration, the conquest, the settlement, mainly of the New World. Key thinkers, key people that you should be thinking of, Pizarro, Cortez, da Gama, Magellan, etc. We see new colonies during this time. We see the British 13 colonies, New Spain in Mexico. We see the Viceroyalty of Peru. We see Brazil, just to name a few. So we see Europe literally in the New World outright conquering large areas of territory. The second phase, and what we're going to talk about today, is mercantilism. And we're going to see these huge trading empires, some of the rivalries that develop, economic rivalries that developed during this time. We're going to talk a little bit about slavery, and then we're going to talk about how some of those colonies and areas that were colonized in Phase 1, i.e. America, the 13 colonies, and how some of these colonies start to gain their independence. We're going to talk about the American Revolution in this chapter, and later on we're going to talk about Latin America gaining its independence a little bit later. The third phase, and we'll talk about this in second semester, right before World War I, will be new imperialism and some of the economic empires rooted from the age of industrialization, the Industrial Revolution in Africa and Asia. And we'll talk about that second semester. And then the fourth phase, we'll talk about that second semester towards the end of class, decolonization, mainly of Africa and Asia in the 20th century. And it's really important to understand about why and how, mainly how Europe is doing this. And Europe is able to establish this domain, literally, over Earth through their technological superiority, guns, ships, and mainly, as we talked about in my class in the second chapter, the Age of Exploration, disease. They were immune. They brought over diseases that they were immune to that the natives were not. Smallpox, measles, influenza, just to name a few, that wiped out these indigenous communities. Okay? And we're talking about this second phase. We're really going to focus on economics, ports, mercantilism, the mother country trading with their baby colony and exploiting that country, that colony for raw materials. The colony sending those raw materials back to the mother country manufacturing something and then selling it back to the colony. And we're going to be talking about trade. The mercantile empires that we're going to talk about are mainly, we're going to talk about Spain, we're going to talk about Britain, we're going to talk about France, and we're going to talk about the Netherlands. And we'll start with Spain, and we're going to talk about the boundaries that were set for these empires after the War of Spanish Succession that ended in 1713, Treaty of Utrecht. Students, you need to know that for the AP test. Okay? And these are the territories that each of these European countries had. Spain, predominantly seen in South America, except for Brazil, that's Portuguese. In North America, Florida, Mexico, Cali, the North American Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, and in Central America, Costa Rica, etc. And Spain did have some Caribbean possessions. Britain, East Coast, Nova Scotia, up in some parts of Canada, Newfoundland, did have some Caribbean possessions, and as we talked about in the 7 Years' War in our previous chapter for my students, we do see Britain in India, and that's going to be one of the theaters of war in the 7 Years' War. France, Canada, St. Lawrence area, we'll see them in Ohio. We know that the British and French will fight in the 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War, in that Ohio, Mississippi territory. France did have some Caribbean possessions, and France was in India and West Africa. Points of contention in the 7 Years' War. Netherlands. The main territory, students, that you really need to know where the Netherlands was at was the East Indies. Indonesia, the Dutch East Indies. Rich in natural resources that the Dutch really exploited, took back to the Netherlands. And it's important to know that the Netherlands was a huge economic giant during this time. They had one heck of a fleet, and they weren't as big as the British. They didn't. We know the British took them down, and was the maritime sea power of Europe. But the Netherlands was powerful, and they were all over the world. They were in South America, in South Africa, Cape Colony. They have trading posts in West Africa, but their main their main territory, their main area of influence was in the East Indies. All right, and this map kind of shows you. Here we go. We see Spain, their territory in Mexico, all in South America, Latin America. We see there's a ton of different territories in the West Indies, the Caribbean possessions. French, British, Spanish, all had territory in these West Indies. The British, you can see along the East Coast, those 13 colonies, which will be the start of America. There we go. We see Spain's got Florida right there. France is all up in Canada, in the middle of America. AP test, if you kind of are like, man, I can't name a territory that some European power conquered during the first phase of interacting with the world or age of exploration, or if you can't remember an area that was a colony of a European power, think about the language that they speak today. Canada, eastern part of Canada, that's French Canada. They speak French. Why? Colonized by the French initially. In America, English, because America was initially, especially in the East Coast, initially conquered by the English. In Latin America, in Brazil, we see Portuguese, Portugal, right? Spanish. So that could just it's not absolute, but it can help you out if you don't remember. All right, let's talk about the Atlantic economy. It's really fundamental to this time, and we're going to be talking about mercantilism. And the Atlantic economy, this was an international economy, and it was centered around trade, world trade, and it was really, really centered around cash crops. As we talked about in the Age of Exploration, the main cash crop that you have to know that really facilitated mercantilism, this trading economy that facilitates slavery, was sugar. Okay, in the areas that we see a lot of the cultivation of sugar was the Caribbean, West Indies, and Brazil. Other important cash crops that you really need to be aware of for the AP test are tobacco, cotton, indigo. Tobacco and cotton really seen in the United States. Tobacco in the southern colonies of the United States, Virginia. Cotton seen in the South, and indigo. Very important cash crops that you need to be aware of that really facilitate this Atlantic economy. And these cash crops directly led to slavery. And the main countries that we see involved in this Atlantic economy were, some of our initial colonizers, exploring countries: Spain, Portugal, Britain, France and Netherlands, and it's really important to note that Prussia and Austria absent from the age of exploration, therefore absent from this Atlantic economy, these mercantilist empires. Okay, oops, didn't really get that one down. All right, so if you're going to talk about the Atlantic economy, you have to talk about mercantilism, and we're going a little bit in reverse order for my class because we just finished talking about the Enlightenment. Mercantilism was the profound economic theory of the 1700s, but we know with the Enlightenment, with new ideas, that this economic theory will eventually die out to capitalism. Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations. Okay, but let's talk about mercantilism. Okay, in my class we've talked about this already, but let's go through some of the key points. Okay, characteristic number one: bullions. Nations defined how well they were doing based on how much metal, aka gold and silver, they were getting. And initially in this Atlantic economy, the country that was doing really well at this was Spain. But they're going to take some L's, some serious L's. And we know that, and that we see that in the war, the war with England, ending with the Spanish Armada. That's one of the first of a couple L's they're going to take. And we know that after the War of Spanish Succession, they're going to be incredibly weak. But nations defined their wealth by how much gold and silver they had. The goal of these nations in terms of mercantilism was to achieve economic self-sufficiency, meaning that they could operate independently. They didn't need anybody else. And nations, in order to do that, they need to be able to feed themselves. And so agriculture will be a fundamental construct of mercantilism in order for these nations to be self-sufficient, in order for these nations to be able to operate independently of other nations. Sea power, okay? You can't be a mercantile empire and have a huge Atlantic trading, empire and going across the oceans to your colonies in the New World, or going trading with trade posts in Africa and Asia, if you don't have a navy, okay? You need your own navy to control your own trade, and the best example of that is England. They had the strongest navy, and therefore we're going to see them develop probably, arguably, the biggest and most important mercantile empire. Taxes. Tax your own people. You control your taxes. Control and manipulate the colonial economies. Number 5 is really important because countries are going to control, the European countries are going to control what their colonies produce and what raw materials they're going to bring to the mother country. And so these mother countries had absolute control over their colonial economies. Another belief of mercantilism was that trade was a zero-sum game, meaning there's winners and losers. Nations could only gain economically at the expense of another country. So if you, take territory from another country, they lose, you win. If you control a part of trade, aka another country is going to lose and you benefit. So it's a zero-sum game, and that's what they believed during this time. And just kind of to reiterate, the big idea of mercantilism was that the government controlled the economy. That's important to understand because that's going to be in huge contrast to capitalism, of where people like Adam Smith, these new thinkers, are going to say, no. Government, you stay out of there. No regulation. Let the natural laws of economics, supply, demand, competition, dictate the economy. Okay. Let's talk about Great Britain just briefly, okay? 1588, Spanish Armada, they are ruling the oceans. And with them ruling the oceans, they are going to be able to develop a vast trading empire, okay? And they are the world's leading maritime empire in the 18th century. They're going to be the world's leading maritime power pretty much until the 1940s of World War II. America will take over that. Great Britain rules the oceans. Okay, and that's a really important theme to know for AP European history. Hitler won't cross the Channel, British Navy. Napoleon won't be able to cross the Channel, British Navy. Okay, that's a really key reason of why some of these people in history, Britain, you have a tough time conquering Great Britain. They're a leading maritime power. Okay, in the context of mercantilism, the Bank of England, Britain will help develop their own mercantilist tendencies with the Bank of England, founded in 1694, and that will provide an important source of money capital for them to be able to start developing some of their colonies, and for them to develop the economic systems overseas, so they could develop these powerful colonial economies and manipulate them and make money off them. Uh, Another example of Great Britain controlling through mercantilism their economy, the government controlling the economy, and that was the Navigation Acts, and these really pissed the colonies off. Um, uh, they basically they were controlling the economy of their colonies. They were controlling what the colonies made, who the colonies could trade with, and typically the colonies could only trade with their mother country, which was England. And if you traded with another country, that was illegal. You could be punished for that. And so these are just two really good examples of Great Britain establishing mercantilism in their economy with their colonies. But we know that this is going to be pretty short-lived with Great Britain, because eventually, remember, Great Britain, a Protestant country, they're going to be open to new ideas. They're going to be mercantile for a little bit, but eventually Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, is going to take hold in Great Britain, and they are going to be a very capitalist nation. Okay, I'm going to end right there for the first part, and then I'll upload that so you can take notes, and we'll start part 2 in a little bit. Here we go. Okay, stop there.